And we are on filmsgonewild.com. My name is John Wildman, and we are going to talk about the film A Question of Survival, which is screening at SEEfest LA, the Southeast European Film Festival. And we have our director, Elka Nikolova, here. Elka, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank
All
you,
right,
John.
so Elka, we always start off with having our filmmaker introduce our audience to their film. They have not seen the film as yet, so tell us about A Question of Survival.
So, A Question of Survival is a documentary film which explores the legacy of the Holocaust in the Balkans through the eyes of three survivors from Bulgaria who live in New York City. They're Sephardic Jews, so which is the smaller part of the Jewish population in the United States and worldwide, and their stories have been sort of unrepresented. So this film is giving a chance to the audience to look into these stories that are a little bit less known.
I will say from the beginning that your film made me miss New York City. And you know, because I know those gentlemen. I've had them at my film festivals, and I love those conversations and those debates that they have. The scenes where the guys are debating on whether or not they should consider themselves survivors, and those wonderful back and forth thing that I just found delightful.
Thank you.
But what I would love for you to talk about initially is, how you decided, because when you're retelling history, when you're reintroducing history, who you have as your spokespeople is so very important, and you have, I think, wonderful people doing that on your behalf because they're so varied in their thought process. So talk about your mindset as you decided this is who I want to present.
So when I started working on this film, I started with the idea, I'm from Bulgaria myself, and I didn't know much about the Holocaust because Bulgaria was a communist country, and the story of the Holocaust was sort of presented through a different lens. And because of the way the Bulgarian story unfolded, the Bulgarian Jewish community was survived. So they have a different perspective on it, but there are all these layers. And in general, the story was told to us from just very specific lens. So we knew very little about it. So once I arrived in New York, of course, there's a large Jewish community, and all of a sudden I was aware of the story from such a different perspective. So I met a Bulgarian Jewish woman at the Museum of Modern Art in New York while I was doing research on a different project. And she came to me, introduced herself, and she said, "Oh, I'm from Bulgaria also, and I'm Jewish." And and we started talking, and I just was totally flabbergasted. I just had no idea. And that's how my interest started. But then the more I was researching this, I became so aware of how complex this story is, and it's a very small country. It's very difficult to understand what really happened. And once I started meeting the people, I was of course trying to tell the history, like to probe them about their memories of the events. And with time, I realized that they were struggling with a completely different question, which was like, are we actually survivors? Because we really didn't experience all the tragedy and the way, mostly the Western European Jews.
Well, I found that fascinating. I found that absolutely fascinating because, again, I always oftentimes say documentaries, they either show us something we had no idea about, or they show us something that we thought we had an idea about and we had no idea about it. And this was one of those where you go, yeah, there was just enough distance geographically, obviously, and politically, that, which you talk about in the film quite often, people were forced to leave, but they weren't being sent to a concentration camp. They were being forced to leave to another territory, and in some cases, right?
No, what actually happened was the deportation was in process, meaning that there were notices were sent that you have to prepare this and this, and you have to be ready to go. But there was a small but very influential, thankfully, group of politicians, intellectuals, the church, who put pressure on the government, who didn't feel it secure enough. And because they were allied to Germany, we were not occupied at the time, they had a little bit more leverage. So they were able to exert pressure on the government. So they basically first postponed the deportation, and ultimately it was, abandoned. So that's how the community survived, but it took some time. And I think what is very important for our situation today, if we have to do the parallel, is how actually important the role of the public opinion is. And
Right.
even though it seemed at the time they didn't realize it, that it seemed that it was impossible to do, but there were enough people who exerted pressure on the government and were able to change the course of history and actually save that community. So for me, that because the government itself was determined to follow its policy through, and it's like so similar to our situation now, right? Like all these policies are implemented, and if the public is not aware and it's not engaged, then these policies, once they start, it's very difficult to stop. So
Right.
they were actually able to kind of catch that in the big ones, because if they were put on the trains, it probably would have been very difficult to stop. But
Exactly.
before that actually happened, they were able to push pressure. And but again, it wasn't the government who willingly wanted to do this. They, followed a very strict procedure of how to. And they were willing to do the deportation. They were planning to do the deportation. So.
Right. Right.
And that's why I think that, but it left the people, the survivors, with all these questions, because, they didn't go through the experiences of the others. And now looking back, they were like, well, are we really survivors or not? But actually they were, because they were so close and they just didn't realize it.
Exactly. The last question I have for you is, and it follows up on what you're talking about in terms of there was a lot of discovery for you in the making of this film. So
Yes.
can you talk about one moment, either during an interview or during the research, or maybe even in the editing bay, where you were kind of surprised by either like how something cut together, or information that you received, or someone's reaction during an interview, where you said, "Oh, this is a special moment for my film," for you personally?
Yes, it was exactly when I was interviewing one of the participants, Robert Bakish, when he kept saying to me, like, I don't remember anything. I don't remember anything. And I kept trying to get more information from him. And then I had at the time a German producer, and he kind of pulled me aside and he said, but maybe he doesn't see himself as a survivor. And that's where this whole thing started. And that's how, once I embraced that idea, then the film became something else. It wasn't anymore just about the historical events, but also how this actually affected these people and how do they see themselves in the relationship of these big events, which is like, at the end of the day, it's like the human experience, and everybody experiences something like this differently. And we are, again, if you look at the pandemic today that we're living through, it's everybody has such a different experience. It depends on class, it depends on where are you geographically. There's so many factors. So and that's actually the story of these three people. They had their own unique experience.
Well, again, like I said, for me, obviously it was informative, but it was also wonderful spending time with the gentleman that you found to talk about this. I really enjoyed the film. The title of the film is A Question of Survival. The director we've been talking with is Elka Nikolova. This is a U.S.-Bulgarian co-production screening at SEEfest LA. Elka, it's been wonderful talking to you about the film.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you.